My name is Reverend Jason Wells. I'm the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Council of Churches. We are an organization that unites 9 diverse denominations of churches in the state of New Hampshire. And this year, we are so pleased to announce the honoree and recipient of the Work of the People Award. This is an award that the Council of Churches denominations come together to honor and recognize people who that the council have worked closely with over the course of the past year on our shared vision and on our shared goals. The term work of the people actually comes from a Greek word that is sometimes rendered as liturgy. That word liturgy, on the one hand, refers to our worship services, the songs of praise that we sing, the prayers that we say when we come together as one people. But the word liturgy literally also means work of the people. It, in some sense, means public works. It is the sorts of things that we accomplish when we put our hands together. And so I'm very excited to have this double meaning of the word work of the people, the ways in which we, as George Fox said, that we let our lives speak by honoring and recognizing Arnie Alpert. Arnie, for 39 years, has been co-director of the American Friends Service Committee New Hampshire program. This is an organization that has Quaker roots and connections, but has been a part of the shared work and of working alongside the Council of Churches on issues as important as death penalty repeal, furthering our work with the Martin Luther King Coalition, as well as the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. So I'm wonderfully excited to honor Arnie for his longtime service in the state of New Hampshire and alongside our faith communities. And I'm wondering, Arnie, if you could introduce yourself a little bit and maybe tell us a little bit about the American Friends Service Committee for members of our churches who might not be aware of the kind of work that the organization does.
Sure. Well, thanks, Jason. And thank you so much to you and to the council for the award. It was unexpected. And now that I'm actually, in going into a new phase in my life in retirement, I guess it is an interesting opportunity to reflect back on things that have happened over the last 4 decades. But looking back even further, if there's one thing perhaps that people know about Quakers or members of the Society of Friends is that they are pacifists. And if you go back in history to 1917, at the time that the United States entered the war in Europe, which people claimed was going to be a war to end all wars, young men who were members of the Society of Friends and because of their religious convictions refused to join the armed services. But because of their religious convictions, they were able to be conscientious objectors. In that position, they were aware of the suffering that was going on among civilians in Europe and didn't want to simply not fight. They wanted to actually go and help. So they created a project. These days we would call it a humanitarian service project, I suppose. And with support from older Quakers, went off to Europe to serve in ambulance brigades where they provided medical assistance and help with housing and food for civilians in Europe who were suffering because of the war that was raging all around them. So that is the birth of what became the American Friends Service Committee, because when the war ended, it was apparent to all that it really was not the war to end all wars, that there would be other wars unless they were prevented. It was obvious that the end of the fighting did not mean the end of the suffering, which had been caused by the armed conflict, and that there were other issues, racism, poverty, other types of violence, which afflicted the human community and which could be addressed by people following the dictates of their conscience in pursuit of more peace and more justice. So the American Friends Service Committee, like I guess many other things, started out as a project and became an organization and has continued its work now for more than 100 years. So I was glad to be able to join the committee as a staff person in 1981, the third staff person for the New Hampshire program, which was actually begun in 1975.
Thank you, thank you. And as you say that about the history of AFSC, I hear a number of themes: peace, nonviolence. You spoke about racism and poverty, and I know those are things that they are special characteristics of the Quaker witness, but they are not unique. These are things that resonate with me in my faith, and I know with people of many faiths. What could you say a little bit about how a Quaker organization like AFSC has worked with other faith communities in New Hampshire?
Well, Jason, one of the fundamental precepts of Quakerism as it's understood now, certainly in this country and in this part of this country, is the idea that there is that of God or something sacred, a spark of the divine in every person. And that is obviously not limited to those who profess the Quaker faith or Quaker tradition, and can include anybody. So that goes all the way back to the beginning of Quakerism. But as an expression of Quakerism, the American Friends Service Committee finds itself working with all kinds of people in all kinds of circumstances all over the world. So that in New Hampshire, I would say it's fair to say that the American Friends Service Committee often found some of its best partners in the work in people who were working in a variety of different faith traditions and who were motivated by their faith to stand up and take action in support of peace, in support of social justice, and in support of change, mostly through what I think we can say as nonviolent methods of activism.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. I would love to ask in that same vein. I am aware that you are not a Quaker, and yet you found.
I identify. I can be. I don't mind being called a Quaker. I identify with Quakers. I do on some occasions. So, but I'm also grew up in the Jewish tradition. So I kind of feel often that I've got a foot in both camps and see an overlap in terms of traditions which have the pursuit of more justice at the core of what people believe and how we act in the world. And I guess also to say that in the Jewish tradition as well as in the Quaker tradition, a lot of what people are concerned about is not so much what we believe, but how we act.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. Was that something as you came into the world of AFSC and into the larger Quaker culture? Was that something you were aware of about the tradition? Was there something sort of that was motivating you to come to AFSC in 1981?
I would say, Jason, that I actually knew very little about Quakers or about the American Friends Service Committee at the time that I joined the staff in 1981. I would say that my main entry point came through my exploration of nonviolence, particularly as I joined a New Hampshire-based organization called the Clamshell Alliance in 1976, which was devoted to trying to prevent a nuclear power plant from being built in New Hampshire. And since the conventional systems of lawyers and laws and courts were doing nothing to stop a corporation aided by the government from imposing a dangerous facility on a community that didn't want it, people resorted to the time-tested techniques of active nonviolence that go back to Thoreau, that go back to Gandhi, that go back to King, that go back, for that matter, to the early Quakers. So I joined that effort first as a college student, but then I became a nonviolent trainer as part of that and began to more deeply explore the traditions of nonviolence. Now, of course, as I did that exploration, I did learn more about Quakers and did become exposed to the work of the American Friends Service Committee. But I would say that the main thing that I brought to AFSC at the time that I was hired in 1981, I was 26 years old. I thought, gosh, if I could do this job for 3 years like my predecessor had, that would be a really long time, because when I was 26, I hadn't done anything for 3 years other than be a student. So that was a big deal for me. But I would say that I think that probably one of the reasons why the search committee chose me at that time was because I already had a record and a great deal of experience in the realm of active nonviolence and training people for action in that tradition.
Well, thank you for that. I do appreciate that, especially I know that I moved to New Hampshire in 2004 with a similar feeling that if I stick around for 3 years, that should be sufficient. And now I've been here going on 15 years.
That's right. Yeah.
But during that time, the shift from 3 years to 39 years of work, I know there are two pieces where you and I have run into each other quite a bit, which is our work around the death penalty repeal. And I've heard, as we continue to work on the Martin Luther King celebration today, that the recognition of Martin Luther King Day in New Hampshire were two campaigns that you were a leader on, and were also multi-decade kinds of organizing and work. And I wonder if there were, as you're at this moment of transition in your career, are there reflections you have about those two campaigns and the kinds of differences that there were between them, or learnings that you had?
Those are both those are long struggles, long campaigns, and they could be long stories, Jason. So I'll capture a couple parts of it. But let me just say, on the death penalty, I remember a meeting in 1985, I believe it was. It was in Canterbury at what was then Horizon's Edge School. Steve Merrill had just become the Attorney General and announced that one of his priorities in that office was going to be to change the state's method of execution from death by hanging to death by lethal injection, or as I like to think of it, poison. And at this gathering of Quakers, a minute was approved, which means a resolution in a sense in the language used by other groups, which stated in effect, talking about the way to kill people is the wrong question for us. We should be talking about how to not kill people, and we should be talking about abolishing the death penalty. So I remember accompanying Marion Baker, who I believe is now a member of your board.
That's correct.
State House, to deliver that statement to members of the legislature and to the governor. And from then on, I began to follow the issue of whether the death penalty would be expanded or abolished. It wasn't until more than a decade later that, with the convening energy of the New Hampshire Council of Churches, the coalition to abolish the death penalty was created, and that took us on another 21 years of activism before the repeal was enacted. So I think that I can say that from the very beginning, people from the faith community were instrumental in the work to abolish the death penalty in New Hampshire, who found, as they looked at their own traditions and their own religious beliefs, that the idea that the state would, through a concerted and premeditated action, kill someone was just absolutely contrary to what they believed in. And so I was glad to be able to work alongside the council and work alongside all of the, what we could call mainline religious denominations, Jewish as well as Christian, in that long effort. And I think that another thing that we can say about that is that, and I guess this is something that I learned over the course of my 4 decades at AFSC, is that people who are motivated by faith oftentimes are the ones who have the character, the persistence, and the ability to keep going year after year, knowing that the world that we are trying to create, while we can imagine it right now, it's not right in front of us. The things that are possible in the short term that we need to pay attention to, whether it's the next election or a vote at the State House or next week's service, is not in itself, it speaks to the world that we're trying to create. But the world we're trying to create is somewhere over the horizon that we can imagine, and we need to get there, but we don't see it right now. Anyway, I have found that it is within the faith community that I find more people who have that perspective. And without them, it's extremely hard to keep up the kinds of long-term struggles for change that are so necessary in the world we live in. Now, as for the Martin Luther King Day campaign, now, of course, Dr. King himself was a clergyman. His work as a civil rights leader, as a human rights leader, as a prophet of democracy in this country was always motivated by and cannot be separated from his role as an African-American Baptist pastor, as someone who had a PhD in theology and who led always from that perspective. So people from the faith community were always involved in the effort to try to declare a New Hampshire holiday for Martin Luther King. But I think one thing we can say about both of these efforts is that they were successful because they drew people from all sorts of different traditions and perspectives. So that by the time that Dr. King's birthday was finally approved in New Hampshire, we not only had the unified support from people in the faith community, but we had strong support from people in organized labor. We had strong support from feminist organizations, from business leaders, and in fact, even from many conservatives in the state who all together saw something in Dr. King that spoke to not only the world that we were trying to create, but the way that we should go about trying to create it. One that starts out by respecting that there is something sacred in every person, that every person has the ability to do what is right, and that because of that, when we do violence to other people, we are doing something that is harmful. And that paying attention to those precepts, to that philosophy, can not only be the most moral, but can also be the most effective way to bring about change in a world which is poisoned by injustice, poisoned by racism, poisoned by inequality, and poisoned by our tendency to resort to violence when we just don't know what else to do.
Well, thank you. There are a number of things I would, like you said, this could be a very long conversation. So there's so many things I'd love to follow up on in what I've just heard you say. I appreciate the appeal to the idea that our faith traditions give us that over the horizon vision, which is about the world we want to see in front of us, but we don't see yet. And that from there we get a support that might be called resilience, that both of those efforts, there were many efforts to repeal the death penalty, and many of them failed. And yet we had the resilience to keep urging and moving toward that over the horizon vision. And I hear also in there that there's a distinction that I sometimes see in faith-based activism circles, that there's an appeal to some deeper values that go beyond the issues of the day. That we do have that vision of a different kind of world that even that goes beyond whether or not we should be arguing. I think you talked about that this should not be a discussion about what sorts of death penalty methods are good, even though that's what's in the newspapers today, but cut to something even deeper. Could you say more about that role of appealing to the values that it kind of underline or deeper than the issues of the day that we engage in activism?
Well, we used to say that, there was a slogan or a tagline that we used at AFSC for a while that was Quaker values in action. Yes. And I always liked that, because while we may get involved in a campaign to raise the minimum wage, or campaigns to abolish ICE, or campaigns to liberate immigrants from incarceration at the county jail in Dover, that we do it because of our values, and our values may also tie these things together. So what I found in working with AFSC was that in general, the people the people that were, in a sense, attracted to us, or that we were attracted to working with, were oftentimes people who, while they might be motivated in the short run by a particular campaign or a particular issue, that they were not, we are not single issue people. We are not issue people. We are people. And because of our values, we understand that there are changes that are necessary in the society in which we're living in. And I think that we sometimes have a tendency to shy away from that because we're worried that if we actually let our light shine, that we're going to scare people away, rather than if we let our light shine in all of its glory, in all of its fullness, that we can illuminate situations and bring people together for that type of long haul change that we've been talking about. Again, there might be times in which if I'm working on a campaign for more affordable housing or to end homelessness, and I'm working with somebody who is a supporter of the death penalty, they might be a little uncomfortable. But I'm generally have found that when we can work together and find common ground with people, we can build, and maybe over time we can learn about each other, and we can all change from our encounters with people who might have some different values and different beliefs on particular issues. But together we can go forward in areas where we may disagree on in other places, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. That I think we learned. I'm not sure that it was a conscious practice at the beginning, but one of the things that we learned in the course of our decades campaigning to end the death penalty in New Hampshire was that there were so many reasons why we should end the practice of the state putting people to death, that there was a reason that could appeal to anyone, whether it came out of our faith, whether it was a concern about a racist criminal justice system, whether it was the idea that the state, the government, cannot be trusted to make a decision of such gravity. As Rennie Cushing, often said, if you don't trust the government to teach your kids or plow your snow, how can you trust the government to decide who should live and who should die? Because that's what the death penalty requires. Well, what we were able to do then is over time build a coalition of people who might have had lots of different reasons for agreeing that the death penalty should be abolished, and we could get together based on that. And we tried to leave the door open so that people who might be for the death penalty today could find a reason to be against the death penalty tomorrow. And over decades, we were able then to grow that movement by keeping that window open, so that by last year, we had solid majorities, in fact, solid enough majorities in the House and Senate that we were able to override a governor veto of the repeal bill. And we had people amongst us who had been supporters of the death penalty and who had changed their minds.
Yes. One of the things that we see frequently in the New Hampshire Council of Churches is is something that I heard you touch on there, which was that we commit to working together. We commit to that sort of solidarity action in spite of differences on other questions. That you could find someone to work with on, I think you said, affordable housing, even though you might have different views of the death penalty or anti-war movement. We sometimes, that within the Council of Churches, Quakers actually have many different ideas about spirituality than the Greek Orthodox or Episcopalians or Lutherans. We might all differ a great deal, but there are places where we do find that sort of coalition building just within us, which I hope that practice then helps us to work with, as you were saying, there are people who are the small government people or the racial justice people or the anti-war nonviolence people, that helps us with our coalition building when it comes to building outside of our walls.
One of the things, Jason, I think
Yeah.
that I've found in working with the AFSC, and certainly see that in the work of my former co-director, Maggie Fogarty, she exemplifies this, but I also have seen it in AFSC staff, not only in other parts of the United States, but in other parts of the world where there are projects, is that because of the values and this idea that anybody might have something to bring into a discussion, into a situation, that the American Friends Service Committee has been a very good force in bringing people together and keeping people going over a long term. Now, the Council of Churches has also done that in very effective ways in New Hampshire. So I think that there's some common ground there between the two organizations that's perhaps worth some more exploration at some point.
Yeah.
But I sometimes think of it as a glue factor, that it's very difficult to maintain some of these campaigns or some of these struggles or sort of these efforts in the day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, sometimes year-to-year, or even decade-to-decade process that turns out to be necessary. So you need to have some institutions that are able to help see what needs to be done this week, as well as how that might be able to continue over a much longer period of time if we're going to be successful. And how can we build relationships with each other that make that possible?
Yes, I was thinking of that as you were addressing the sort of long haul work that some of these projects took. And I was thinking, you mentioned the name of Marion Baker, who remains on the board of the New Hampshire Council of Churches to represent the Quakers. And but other than that one person, I would imagine none of the board members were on the board in 1985 when you were responding to then Attorney General Merrill. There are bishops who came and went. There are clergy who came and went. There are certainly lay people who came and went during that time, so that the same goal and the same vision can be brought forward. And sort of long-lasting institutions and that appeal to deeply held values can make that happen. I think that
That's right.
even though the individuals change, the same actions and values can be brought forward.
Now, of course, we may be bringing forward some, at times discover that some of the values we've been bringing forward have been backwards, or sometimes we perhaps have ignored issues that should have gotten attention. And with our long traditions of decades or centuries, it can be difficult to change course. So that while we value that, we also need to be open to what Quakers might call the continuing revelation, or something new, some new wind, new ideas coming into the room that can help us make adjustments.
Yes, that our institutions are not themselves sort of morally neutral things. They can be forces for moral goods, but they've also been used for moral evil. And I appreciate that appeal to the Quaker continuing revelation. I know other Christian traditions might refer to the acts of self-examination and even repentance, that we should evaluate our past actions and use that as a grounding and draw on our spiritual traditions for reform, for change, to find the places where we were not the helpful force we thought we were, and to reform ourselves for the better. I guess one last thing on my mind as we move on was that over the time that I have known you, and we've worked side by side, you've been well known as a song leader, which I know is you're smiling about it now, and but it's something that I know you've talked about the power of song from your work in the Clamshell Alliance, the place of song in labor movements, anti-war movements, even in Black Lives Matter happening right now. Could you say something about the power of song, which is a powerful in our churches, in our faith traditions as well?
That's right. I mean, Certainly religious congregations in most traditions that I'm aware of have traditions of song. And when we sing together, we are creating community. Bernice Johnson Reagan, who was one of the freedom singers back in the 60s and was later the founder of the African American women's singing group Sweet Honey in the Rock, used to say, maybe she still does, that the word conspiracy derives from the Greek konspire, which means to breathe together. So when we sing together, we are breathing in and out together, and we're engaged in some type of hopefully a positive conspiracy for change. So that oftentimes just like our religious congregations can be animated or brought together by song, our social movements can be animated and brought together by song. And that certainly, we look at the African American freedom movement, which was so closely tied to the African American church. We see that as a singing movement. But we can look at the labor movement as a singing movement. We can look at, we see right now coming out of the experiences of violence against African Americans and others committed by the police or committed by other institutions. We see some amazingly powerful songs coming out of that. And some of those will be songs that perhaps we'll be learning decades from now to help us understand the moment and help us figure out how we move together toward the place we're trying to get to.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. I've certainly seen in that realm of faith songs, which sometimes become the freedom songs, that those were songs that were often the places people went for the resilience and the strength to keep on going in the difficult experiences they found themselves in. Sometimes those movement songs, the freedom movement songs, were the faith songs with a few words swapped out.
That's right.
That I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom was a song about Jesus and had a parallel movement. And that the songs take on a sort of ritual importance. I can hardly imagine getting together at the Martin Luther King celebration in Manchester and not ending by singing "We Shall Overcome." The song has a sort of a bedrock place in what.
But it's interesting that if you look at the history of that song, Jason, you find that the song was popularized by Pete Seeger, who was traveling around the country singing at different civil rights rallies. But Pete learned it at the Highlander Center in Tennessee. And the way it got to the Highlander Center was from some African American women who were trade unionists who were meeting at Highlander and brought in that song, which again started out as a song, "I Will Overcome."
Yeah.
We will overcome. Pete changed it to "We Shall Overcome" because he thought it sounded better. And that song has then spread all over the country and all over the world, sung by people who probably have little understanding of its North American and African American religious tradition that it came out of, or the fact that it was brought forward by people in the labor movement.
Right. Yeah. I appreciate so much how intertwined those needs are. I know I've heard you say that that we can evaluate in some sense or tell the strength of movements through the strength of their music, and how important these are for our resilience, not just personally and individually, but collectively as signs of our resolve.
Yeah.
And a lot of those songs have themes of journey and travel in them. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Step by step, the longest march can be won. That there's something about the role of spiritual journey, but also movement journey.
That's right. So we talk about a movement. We call ourselves movements.
Yes.
So part of that idea of movement is actually incorporated into those songs. One of the songs I was just thinking about this morning, Jason, is "Wade in the Water."
Yes.
One step. And for me, that song speaks to, I'm not sure where it is in the Torah, but there's at least a legend that when the Israelites were fleeing from Egypt and they reached the Red Sea, that there was one man named Nahson who took that first step into the Red Sea, and that only then did God come down and part the waters and enable everybody to walk through, but that it required that one step forward in order for that liberation to take place. So we sort of think about those things. How do we take those steps forward? How do we take those steps toward the place we're trying to get to? We're on our way to the freedom land.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Won't turn back.
Yes, yes. I've been thinking a lot just on the terms this is the terms of faith and faithfulness, that there is that act of faith of taking that step out there and taking the step of a journey and not being certain what God will do, and doing it anyway, and then finding that that these forces all come together between the leadership of one person's faith, the people around them, and an act of a greater spirit that comes to bear, but also the sense of faithfulness that I think that what our values tell us, that if something was right or wrong in 1985, it remained right or wrong in 2019 when we came to our discussion about the death penalty. That some of the questions in front of us changed, or the people around us changed, but the fundamental faithfulness was something that could be sort of relied upon in those moments. I'm wondering, Arnie, if there's anything else that we haven't touched on in our interview that you wanted to make sure to share with us today?
I guess, Jason, the only thing I would say is we're obviously in a very difficult time right now with the pandemic, with the prevalence or the at least apparent increase in the virulence of racism and anti-Semitism that is around us, in what seems to be an increasing tendency for people to actually take up arms or use violence to enforce their own political beliefs. I think that there is a strong need, which can come from the faith community, for people to step forward and say that the way of nonviolence, the way of active love, is not only more in keeping, again, with who we are and the world that we're trying to create, but that is the way to bring about transformation, to transform injustice to justice, to transform hate into love, to transform inequality into equality, and so on. So I think that I'm going to be hopeful that the Council of Churches and that the groups that make up the council will continue to be advocates and examples on how to make that happen, as teachers and as with individuals and congregations that demonstrate that in their action, as well as in what gets preached from the pulpit. But that's where we will find people who will help others understand this is the way that we must move forward if we're going to try to create that world that we can imagine, but that we can't quite see it right in front of us today.
Oh, well, thank you so much for this, Arnie. I love those parting words. I'm finding myself motivated and always glad to talk with you and to hear you speak. Thank you for your faithfulness in all of your work, and for your commitment to let your life and to encourage other people to let their lives speak as well. So,
well, great. Well, thank you very much, Jason, to you and to the council, and good luck going forward.
All right. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Keep your eyes on the prize.